Everyone. My name is Dr. Devika Dutt. I'm a lecturer in the Department for International Development, and I'm the organizer for this seminar series. In the seminar series, as you know, we discuss issues of development in a kind of very interdisciplinary manner, traversing various parts of the world and various theoretical frameworks. Yeah, and so today I'm very excited to welcome the editors of this amazing new book, She Who Struggles. You can see it sitting on the table. So just to introduce our speakers, so both of the editors are here, and they'll both speak in turn. First we have Marral Shamshiri, who is a PhD candidate in international history at the Lenin School of Economics. Her project looks at the history of the Iranian left, focusing on transnational political connections between Iranian and Arab revolutionary movements in the 1960s and 1970s. Her recent writing and research has been published in Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, History Workshop Magazine, a Journal for Body and Gender Research, and many others. And of course, her most recent, I guess not most recent, but the publication we're here to talk about today is She Who Struggles, Revolutionary Women Who Shaped the World, published with Pluto Press last year. Along with that, we have Sorcha Thomson, who is an honorary research fellow at Birkbeck University of London and an editorial fellow at History Workshop. Her PhD thesis explores the history of international solidarity with the Palestinian liberation movement in the mid-20th century. It has been conducted as part of the Entangled Histories of Palestine and the Global New Left Research Project at Roskilde University. She is a co-editor of the books Palestine in the World and, of course, She Who Struggles, and has contributed to several journals, books, and magazines, including the Journal of Palestine Studies and the Global South. So I'm particularly excited about this book. I read bits of it, but I was very excited to see that this book exists because, as we know, women often get left out in histories of basically everything. Specifically also revolutionary movements. Every time we think of inspiring figures from revolutions of years past or decades past or centuries past, often the names that always come up are those of men. And there's sort of a double exclusion, especially because when the movements are like specifically revolutionary, anti-system, anti-capitalist, they're kind of further excluded from retellings of those histories. Either those histories are co-opted in liberal fashions or they're just not told. So that's why I was very excited that this book exists, and thank you both for putting this out in the world. As I guess, since I'm still talking, I can take a moment to talk about we do similar work, and I'm an economist, and we do similar work in economics, talking about not just the missing that there is a problem of missing women in the discipline of economics, but not just missing women, but missing progressive, radical, theoretical frameworks in economics. And me and some of my co-authors are writing books precisely talking about not just this, but how we decolonize economics. And one of those is sort of reviving that kind of theoretical tradition, and also the scholars and frameworks that look at these alternative framings outside of a very small neoliberal, neoclassical economics framework. But yeah, so without further ado, I'm going to let you speak, but you guys can speak for about 40-45 minutes, and then we'll have Saskia, who will give her comments. Actually, I'm going to take this moment to introduce Saskia as well, so that I don't have to come and interrupt you guys' your conversation. So our discussant today will be Saskia Zelenska. Saskia is a PhD researcher in the Department of International Development at QCL, where she has written her thesis on adolescent pregnancy and multi-sided violence in Peru. She's one of the founding members of the editorial collective for the online publication Feminist Perspectives, and also part of the KCL, what does SSPP stand for? Social Science and Public Policy, Decolonizing the Curriculum Workstream. She recently started a research position at the University of Sheffield, where she is investigating adolescent pregnancy in Cuba, Colombia, and Mexico. So I feel like we're going to have a really good conversation. I'm really excited to get it started. So I am now about to shut up, and I'll hand it over to you guys.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me? I don't have a loud voice. First of all, thank you so much for this invitation. We're both just really excited to be here and to have this opportunity to talk about the book, which came out last year. So it's a book that Sorcha and I have co-edited, and what we did was we brought together a number of academics and activists to kind of each contribute essays to this bigger collection. And each person who kind of writes in this book, including ourselves, kind of specifically focus on themes of kind of women in history, revolutionary history, and political movements. So I guess from both Sorcha and I's sort of perspective, we both work on this historical period and I guess topic that is now very popular and is gaining, more interest in the university, which is the global 60s, the kind of, I guess, era of decolonization struggles, and this moment of like revolutionary upheaval across the world. And for us, we were kind of encountering this absence of women in our work, in the histories that we were reading, and in a lot of the conferences and things that were taking place a few years ago. So kind of connected to that, we were quite interested in bringing together people who we knew were working on really interesting movements and the lives of, women. And what we really wanted to do with this project was to not just sort of produce a book that was going to be for academics, but one of the main things we were interested in was kind of making that available to a wider audience. So, some of these discussions are being had in universities, or like in our fields, but also maybe not enough. Women are still sort of marginalized. But beyond that, we kind of really felt that this was an important, sort of project to, I guess, inform activist movements today. And at the time of writing, actually, sort of 2020, that kind of, moment post BLM, when there were lots of debates about the role of public history and sort of movement histories from below, really kind of, influenced us in writing this book. So the main, problem that we were concerned with, which you've really nicely already outlined, is this absence of women. Specifically for us, it was from the historiographies of national liberation movements, revolutionary struggles for decolonization, and the global histories of the left that I mentioned are currently being written. So when we do think about the revolutionaries who shaped the 20th century, the people that come to mind often are the male leaders, the Lenins, the Maos, Mandelas, etc. And so for us, this kind of key question was, where are the revolutionary women in this history? How can we find these women? What can we gain about learning about their revolutionary lives, their political activities, and essentially, learning more about women who have been completely overshadowed by iconographies of male leaders. So the kind of key question is, for us, it's this question of where women's liberation, gender and sexual politics, and feminism lie in transformative and political movements of the 20th century. This question has often been referred to as the woman question, and it has been grappled with both by the movements historically that we're referring to, but we also kind of think about the woman question and how it relates to how this history is kind of being written today. And so for us, the woman question has been a secondary concern in two ways. Firstly, often historically, the question of women's liberation was secondary to the more imminent, I guess, question of national liberation. And this is something we see in a lot of the movements and the stories in this book. And secondly, kind of concerning sort of academic discussion, the debate in historiography today, women have been sidelined and marginalized, and the place of gendered politics hasn't really been written. So our aim really was to bring women into this narrative. We wanted to kind of not just present a kind of history that would be deemed as women's history, because that's where some of this work has been done and it is really important. But for us, it was that we don't want to just confine this to gender or women's studies, but actually history of revolutions, revolutionary movements as a whole have so much to learn when we do pay attention to the women in the story. So the next kind of concept that this book kind of also engages with is third worldism, and I guess it speaks directly to the revolutionary tradition in the global South. So in trying to kind of address the male-centric record, we were also interested in reviving revolutionary global traditions that actually existed in the global South. And so most of the women that kind of we feature in this book, they were communist women, they were socialist women, and they were anchored in places in Asia, Africa, and the Americas, almost all with the exception of Ireland, which we also included. This was, as I said, this kind of, because we really wanted to, address this kind of obscurity of women from the global South. But for us, we kind of, use this language of the third world as a revolutionary term that many of these organizations and groups kind of would use themselves. So I think kind of in the context of current discourse, the global South becomes a term that we use in a kind of neoliberal, modern, current framework. But for us, this concept of the third world links to what Vijay Prashad has written about, that the third world wasn't a place, it was a project. And actually, most of the women and a lot of the kind of movements that we talk about in this book use that language. And so the book really kind of, is written in this tradition of revolutionary third worldism. And finally, from our own contemporary position, we were just really interested in presenting stories that we knew existed of a different kind of revolutionary and sort of socialist feminism. And partly that was to challenge the liberal kind of white girl boss feminisms that we constantly see today. So by highlighting this tradition of revolutionary feminist politics, we kind of looked at how women that this book covers weren't just interested in the kind of oppression of women in relation to men, so a kind of singular focus on gender or patriarchy, but it was a real revolutionary politics that saw the system of economic exploitation. So capitalism is something that also had to be overturned. So it was kind of both of these things that were really important for us, in how we kind of engage with this work, but also for many of the women that are written about in this book. That said, the concept of feminism is quite tricky for a lot of the women in this book, in the sense that because they subscribe to kind of communist or anti-colonial traditions, there was that historical tension that socialism was more interested in class and feminism was a bourgeois kind of, initially, a bourgeois liberal movement. So there are tensions, and some of these come through in the book, which we could maybe talk about later as well. But yeah, so broadly speaking, then the collection brings together 13 chapters, which feature women from Cuba, Ghana, Mali, Ireland, Palestine, Japan, Iran, Vietnam, Kurdistan, South Africa, Egypt, the Philippines, and El Salvador. And the political activities of the women from these places stretch from the 1930s to the present. And I'd just like to say that the women that we presented in this volume, the chapters kind of can be read as individual stories of a woman and what that tells you about a particular revolutionary moment and that time and that movement in particular. But we were quite sort of keen on not presenting these as just individual stories and sort of people who, single-handedly championed causes. Actually, for us, it was about placing women side by side to see what the bigger connected story also could be when we, looked at all of these different women engaged in similar struggles. And so to that end, we ended up using a Marxist feminist framework in the book to show that we can learn so much more about capitalist, imperialist relations and how imperialism functions by placing the experiences of women side by side and seeing how that kind of allowed us to see how social relations were then formed. So yeah, just to kind of end here, the women in this book, for them, women's liberation had to be achieved alongside the social and economic emancipation of all people of the world. And through their lives, we really wanted to bring forward a revolutionary politics that was committed to dismantling this kind of imperialist system that oppressed not just the women, but the majority of humanity.
Thanks. I'm just going to quickly talk about some of the influences that we had in making this book. which of course wouldn't have been possible without all the pre-existing work of feminist scholars, activists over many years. One of them in particular was the tradition of history from below, which very broadly means the idea that history is not only shaped by powerful elites and the ruling classes, but in fact, the lives, experiences, everyday activities of ordinary people and less powerful groups, which can be found often at the margins or beneath narratives of the so-called great men of history. Also inspirational was the pioneering work which has been done more recently on radical feminist biographies. To name a few, there's been books of Claudia Jones, Leila Khaled, Beatrice Allende, Ella Baker. And also we're interested by the method that the feminist scholar Bell Hooks talks about, which is to write accessibly. This pursuit of accessibility she describes as a feminist praxis in itself. And it was with that we wanted to write and encourage the contributors to write in the most accessible way possible so that the book can reach wider audiences. We kind of had young activists in mind when we were doing that. At the same time, it was really important that the women's lives that are featured were grounded in rigorous historical research. And in order to do that, it's important for historians that you follow the primary sources. One of the biggest, I think, virtues of this book is that it includes so many primary materials that have never before been translated from English. These include, which are particularly important for doing feminist history, things like letters, memoirs, and autobiographies as well, which can allow us to see these women's lives in their own words or in the words of those who knew them. Amongst these translated memoirs are a nurse's diary from Mali, clandestine writings from Japan, Cuba, and Iran, memoirs of prison resistance in Kurdistan, with poetry from South Africa and Iran, letters of political friendship between the Philippines, US, and El Salvador, and an Egyptian student leader's memoir from the 1970s. This memoir in particular, I'll talk about a little bit because I think it shows us something about what we can learn from women's writings, which we don't always get to see in archival materials from state or political movement archives, which are typically what many people rely on to write history. So this is a memoir by Egyptian student leader Arwa Saleh, and it is talked about in the chapter written by Kanwal Hamid and Sarah Salem. They tell us how Arwa Saleh was a leader of Egypt's student movement in the 1970s and led sit-ins at Cairo University. She was the author of various books on and translations of Marxist literature into Arabic and a member of the Central Committee of the Egyptian Workers' Party. She ended her life in exile in Spain, struggling with mental illness and the harshly negative response to her memoir from former comrades. This memoir, called in English The Stillborn, is an important text that speaks to the struggles of women revolutionaries in the aftermath of Nasserism and Egypt. It is one of the few sources that exist of this Egyptian student movement in the 1970s, and through it, Arwa Saleh emerges as a key theorist of anti-colonialism in Egypt and beyond, as well as a communist and feminist intellectual in her own right. Kamal and Sarah write about the memoir and how Arwa writes. They say, in her memoir, there is a blurring of the boundaries between theory and the political and the self. She writes about haunting, ghosts, defeat, and hope, tracing a life world through affective registers. Emotion is almost never brought up as an individual experience, although in private correspondence listed as an appendix, she notes she wrote the book to make sense of her feelings. Instead, emotion is collectivized, made to speak for her comrades and the entire student movement. I think this is just one example from inside the book that shows us how these memoirs written by women can reveal elements of the emotional experience of revolution, which is so often absent in political and state archives, and allow us to see these women as revolutionary actors in their own rights as well, contributing to intellectual debates and political movements. There's also a problem with written records, memoirs, which is that so many of the women involved in these movements, of course, couldn't or didn't record their experiences in the written form. So one way in which we kind of approach that problem in the book is that we include two testimonies. one of which from a revolutionary, Palestinian revolutionary called Jihan Helou, who was active from the late 1960s until today, although the nature of that activity has changed dramatically. And another testimony from a collective in Pakistan called the Women Democratic Front. And both of these, the collective and Jihan, hadn't ever recorded these testimonies in this way before. So it was actually a very enriching experience even getting to do that with them. To give a short sense of the value of what these testimonies can offer into the worlds of these women, I think I'll read a short extract from Jihan's testimony. So, yeah, as a Palestinian woman, this is what she writes. I was born in Haifa, Palestine in 1943. My father was one of the founders of the Arab Trade Union. I was 4 years old when I was uprooted with my family during the Nakba, the catastrophe in Arabic, of 1948, to Lebanon. We lost our home and were dispossessed. Yet we believed this was temporary, but we would soon return home. In high school in Lebanon, I started to advocate for our right to return to Palestine. When I joined the American University of Beirut, I was elected in the graduation year as the president of the Political Science Society. It was an easy decision for me to join Fatah, the largest of the Palestinian resistance organizations, immediately after 1967, and I was quickly appointed to their leadership in Lebanon. Fatah became the largest party of the leadership of the PLO after the 1967 war. I participated in its media section in international relations, but my main work was to organize women in the Fatah movement. The task was not easy. Most Palestinian women in Lebanon were living in ghetto-like situations imposed by the government on the refugee camps and were oppressed by reactionary social norms. I held a deep belief in the right of women to struggle for their full liberation. Grassroots struggle was challenging, especially at the start, but amazingly, the liberation of the camps and social transformation within them was speedy. Unfortunately, we soon had to face the civil war, launched in 1975 by the Lebanese fascists, and continuous Israeli aggressions on Lebanese villages and camps. In this dangerous revolutionary road, many beloved comrades were lost and sacrificed. We fought for the revolution to grow and solidify, all while we were under fire and facing attempts of liquidation. At the same time, there was also the enemy from within. Fatah was an ideologically plural party, and the rift between the rationale of the left and the right was growing. My early Fatah leader did not like my feminist views and expressed his dismay by asking if I were there to liberate women. I said, yes, I want to liberate women and liberate Palestine. You can't liberate Palestine without liberating women. At the time, I was demoted and marginalized, accused of being too left-wing. However, I regained my position after 2 years. She goes on in this testimony to talk about her role as a leader of the General Union of Palestinian Women and taking part in a whole range of international activities from India, Cuba, Nicaragua, and more. But I just think, especially in this current context, such a testimony is really important as reminding us of the long history of Palestinian revolutionary struggle and the place of women within that. Account of women, Palestinian women, not as victims or statistics, but as active agents in political processes. She discusses in this also the challenges of being part of those political processes, the obstacles that she would have faced. But overall, it speaks to the collective struggle of Palestinian women as revolutionaries with agency, which is so often erased in dominant historiographies and hegemonic discourses about that liberation movement and others today. That's me on that bit.
Thanks. There's 2 more sections. I'll speak then, so she speaks again, and then hopefully we have some good discussion. So I think now we kind of want to talk a bit more about some of the lives of these women, some of the things that we found, and actually some of the insights into this woman question that we've talked about. So this broader map, to touch on what Sorcha has just said, the broader landscape and map in which anti-colonial, communist, socialist, revolutionary women found themselves in, was a map in which Palestine was a really important reference point for many anti-colonial struggles after 1967, especially. But it wasn't just Palestine. So if we think about the geography of Third Worldism, which I kind of mentioned earlier, the movements that really were most well known and inspired so many revolutionaries and movements were the struggles in Vietnam, Cuba, Algeria, South Africa. And so the revolutionary women that we find in this book They learned from other movements. They shared a revolutionary canon, which included people, you know, like Lenin, Mao, Zetkin, or Luxemburg, but also what we found is that many of their movements would produce their own studies on revolutionary experiences in Vietnam, in Cuba, in Algeria, and elsewhere. So those connections were really important. So after 67, as I kind of mentioned, the Palestinian Revolution became an important anti-imperialist, anti-colonial cause for many movements around the world. And one of the women in this book, Fusako Shigenobu, is a Japanese woman who, was very kind of strongly connected to the Palestinian cause. And she ended up moving to the region. So Fusako Shigenobu was born in 1945. She initially became involved with the leftist student movement of the 1960s in Japan. She would join the Japanese Red Army, which was a militant group that wanted to bring global revolution to Japan. Her life is very controversial and very extraordinary, as she would become the leader of the Japanese Red Army and move to Lebanon and establish ties with the Lebanon-based PFLP. She was in prison actually for 22 years and was only released actually just when this chapter was being written by Jeremy Randall. And so he, in this chapter, really shows us that she was a leader of this organization, which was extremely rare for militant groups, you know, on the far left. And the Japanese Red Army kind of becomes known as a leading group in support of the Palestinian liberation struggle through controversial militant attacks. And so Jeremy, in his chapter, he kind of shows us how the Red Army's actions, while they were painted in a certain way and have been and are understood in a certain way, he tries to complicate things to show that there was a theory of kind of revolutionary and political violence behind what they did. And so he reads Fusako Shigenobu not only as a revolutionary leader, but also as a writer, a theorist, and an activist of world revolution. Elsewhere in the book, we also see how this kind of theme and the connections between different movements comes up through imagery and iconography that moved through different locations. So the image of the revolutionary woman from Vietnam traveled and inspired a lot of movements, especially the Palestinian movement, the Iranian left, many others, in fact. And there's a really nice chapter in the book where the authors kind of show us how there were two competing figures of Vietnamese sort of liberation or revolutionary women. And initially, you kind of had both figures that could have ultimately been sort of circulated with that kind of global leftist sort of network, but it's ultimately the kind of communist Vietnamese image that circulates. And this is very kind of similar to and related to, in fact, this idea that women hold up half the sky and that women were equal to male counterparts in liberation movements, which was very central to Maoist revolutionary principles, and which would have also influenced a lot of the groups that we talk about in this book. So this kind of links into this question of militancy, which is a really important thread in this book for us. And many of the chapters engage with this question in lots of different ways. So in many of the liberation struggles that we're looking at, women raised arms alongside their male counterparts. But if we do look more closely, the imagery of that kind of woman holding a gun, being equal to men, that circulated very widely, it didn't actually always reflect in the activities that the women actually engaged in. And so this imagery became a symbol of anti-colonial revolution, but examples in this book really show us the realities of what it meant to be a woman engaged in revolutionary struggle. So, for example, in the Cuban context, there was opposition to women at times joining the Revolutionary Front, and they were often given gendered roles, sewing uniforms, cooking for the men, for instance. In Iran, Marzia Ahmadi Oskouei was an Iranian woman who was part of the left-wing revolutionary movement in opposition to the Shah in the 60s and 70s. And she became what Lenin called a professional revolutionary. So she devoted her life to becoming a full-time militant and engaged in this armed struggle against the Shah. She was an urban guerrilla, which meant that she would operate with her organization, the People's Fada'i organization of Iran. They would operate in the city. And so for them, the kind of the team houses that they would live in were just regular houses, and those would be their bases and sites of activity, that they tried to just kind of blend in with the city. So while she was, always carrying a revolver and engaging in sort of militant activities, to some extent, when you look at kind of a lot of the attacks or the kind of militant sort of practices of the group, you see that it's often still the men who were kind of engaged in that. And when we look at her activities, we see that she was a militant, but she was also a militant poet. And a lot of her writing and poetry would later become really well known within the movement and now increasingly in the history of the Iranian left. So she was a teacher, she was a poet, she was a writer, a student organizer in her earlier years, and then a guerrilla fighter. And for me, I wrote the chapter about her life. I was really interested in her poetry because while it does address the subject of women and gender to some extent, it actually isn't very feminist, and was sort of, some of her poetry kind of tried to engage women to get involved in the armed struggle. So the purpose wasn't necessarily an interest in women's liberation, but it was still in this framework of national kind of liberation. And I guess what I said earlier about different sort of views towards feminism, certainly for a lot of the groups at the time, including the Iranian left, for them, they had really, in general, quite negative views of feminism because they saw it as a bourgeois, Western, sort of imperial construct. And yeah, it was really shunned in lots of ways, which another chapter in the book actually really highlights and shows how then in 1979, when the Iranian Revolution takes place, there's a quick rollback of women's rights, and actually a lot of those women who were engaged in the revolutionary movement at the time, today kind of look back and think, well, yeah, actually those movements were placing women's liberation as a secondary concern, and that's had real material kind of consequences today. So other chapters in the book as well, they show us similar examples of militant cultural work more broadly. So there's a chapter on Lindiwe Mabuza, who was part of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. And she shows us how in the South African liberation movement, culture was used as a weapon of resistance. So militant poetry was used by South African women. It highlighted the gendered nature of their experiences in the ANC's camps in exile, and actually showed that beyond tropes of militant women, as heroes, the reality of their day-to-day was difficulties in accessing food, harmful contraceptions that they were using at times, and not having, sanitary products to use for their menstrual cycles, for instance. And also, linked to this kind of militancy is another kind of concept that comes through in this book is this idea of care. So Elif Sarakan writes the chapter on Sarah Sakina Gensiz, who was a Kurdish freedom movement fighter. And in the chapter about her life, we see how there was a gendered experience for revolutionary women at the front lines, in the sense that through their struggles, there was a lot of care, there was a lot of this concept of revolutionary love that she writes about, and that helped women sustain themselves in that movement. So women's revolutionary work in general and overall, as the book kind of complicates and shows, was more than just the picking up of arms. And by placing various women's lives side by side, we see that they weren't just fighters. They were poets, they were writers, they were diplomats, teachers. They took part in conferences, political tours. Some took up arms in struggles against dictatorships and colonial occupations. Others formed solidarity committees and engaged in various forms of cultural and literary work, worked in hospitals, universities, and so much more. So for us, one of the key findings of this book was that by looking at women's lives, we can actually see that the revolutionary women we're writing about engaged in a real variety of practices.
Yeah, thanks. I guess so, yeah, following the variety of practices at every point was opposition, and another major theme of the book is state violence. And this is not something I was necessarily expecting when we brought these chapters together, but the amount of times that these women are imprisoned or incarcerated in multiple chapters, in multiple of these women's lives, they spent time in prison or they spent time very close to those who were in prison. In particular, I think of notable mention is the chapter on the Kurdish women's movement, where Kurdish women in prison faced extreme violence from the Turkish state, but also where they were able to wage acts of resistance. So they engaged in hunger strikes, they passed messages under the door, they taught each other, they sang together, acts of resistance big and small, which is kind of another thing which is replicated with the Palestinian women, the number of them in prison for many, many years, which kind of highlights the role of prison both as a site of oppression, but also as a kind of hub of resistance. In the Turkish case in particular, Elif Sarakan, who wrote that chapter, she argues that there is something unique about the prison experience for Kurdish women, with while prison resistance is a major theme in a lot of revolutionary movements, she says that actually what you see in the Kurdish women's experience in prison is the nucleus of the idea that they needed their own autonomous Kurdish women's movement and therefore a kind of women's liberation ideology, which we can see again the legacies of today. And she argues that that actually emerged from that experience of women in prison together. We can consider these women, and we might do as political prisoners, but at the time they were criminalized and incarcerated. And I think across the different chapters, it speaks to a sort of transnational counter-insurgency practice or strategy, which is derived from colonial and imperial mechanisms of oppression. And by recognizing these in the book, I think it can also begin to position some of the practices that we see today as part of a longer tradition, when we see the silencing and intimidation of protest increasingly through criminal means here, or when we see militarized state violence against liberation movements elsewhere. It can help to remind us that these are not isolated national practices, but they're part of a transnational mechanism of counter-revolution or counter-insurgency. And if you recognize that, you begin to see that in order to resist it, we need international solidarity, quite simply. On international solidarity, there's one final point I'd like to mention about this particular era, which is the role of international infrastructures and institutional networks that played such a big role in allowing these women to do the work that they were doing. On a macro level, the fact that the Soviet Union existed meant that these women were not operating in a unipolar world. The Soviet Union created a balance to US hegemony, and it funded alternative forums where women could meet. Socialist organizations also paid for tickets for women from the third world countries to travel to international conferences. And a lot of the women in the book talk about the role that these conferences played in allowing them to meet, sometimes for the first time, their sisters from other parts of the world. But not just to meet, they also organized together in these spaces. Of particular significance was the Women's International Democratic Federation, which I'll now say just as the WIDF. It was founded in 1945 in Prague as an anti-fascist organization, and it was funded by the Soviet Union. And it really did create a space for women, socialist women, to come together as an alternative to the US-aligned international women's unions. An example of the kind of impact that could have is for the Palestinian women, they were able to go there and build alliances with friendly socialist feminist women's organizations and organize together to bring the proposal to bigger stages, such as the UN, where they played a big role in passing UN Resolution 3379, which declared Zionism as a form of racism. And you can really trace that resolution back to the work that was happening in the WIDF through these women who were able to meet there and build connections, but also kind of organize on a really deep level. What are we going to do? How are we going to put this forward? What arguments are we going to make? How are we going to contest their arguments? The Pakistan Women's Democratic Front also talks about, I mean, their name is also, very similar to it, but it's based on I guess, the inspiration that movement had, and they talk about the impact that the loss of that infrastructure has had on their work. They say, it stopped functioning as an active body, and today there's no equivalent platform where socialist feminist groups can do international solidarity work. They're actually members of the Progressive International, but from their testimony, they speak about the limitations of feminist work within the Progressive International and how to them, the main task is building organizational networks again that can, derive from the grassroots work and build up from that. Very briefly, the last kind of example of grassroots work in the book, which brings us to El Salvador into the 80s, which is a chapter written by Molly Todd when she talks about this thing called sistering, which began in the mid-80s as a form of transnational human rights and social justice activism in El Salvador. This was a time when El Salvador was immersed in violent conflict. The government, backed by the US, was intent on quashing a coalition of armed insurgents in a national liberation movement, which was its support was mostly based in the countryside, where campesinos, roughly translated as peasants, had gained significant experience with agricultural cooperatives, peasants' unions, and other forms of communalism over the previous decade. So as a grassroots practice, sistering linked displaced Salvadorans with US-based groups, where they could model alternative horizontal structures of engagement. And they've created a number of committees that would work across borders and in their localities to support Salvadoran women who were war displaced. She describes the way they worked, and I think I'll just quote from her: in the social, economic, and political sphere, including free healthcare and education, clothing and shoe workshops, community stores, and public work projects like the construction of homes, roads, and bridges. In many ways, they rebuilt their communities. And I think it's an example of the horizontally organized solidarities that can be found in this book, some of which does have legacies in grassroots NGO work today, but a lot of which has been lost with the decline of the infrastructures which made possible so many of these connections. I'll stop there, but thank you for listening. And yeah, it's difficult to do justice to all the different chapters in this book as the editors, but we did want to bring these together because we don't just think they should be looked at as isolated instances of historically distant actors, but like they do mean something when they're put together relevant to today. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you both so much. So forgive me, I'm probably going to repeat a lot of the stuff that you've already said, but I will start by kind of summing up what I think is your kind of contributions, and then I'm going to gush about how much I really enjoyed this book, and then have a few questions for you both, and then we can open up to the audience. Let me start by saying that when I was reading this book, I found it just the most wonderful, uplifting antidote to kind of contemporary global world politics. No, so at a time when it feels like the radical left is being beaten down, and we have the rise of nationalism, in a globalized context, and the rise of populism and neoliberal individuality. Reading this book and reading the histories, especially the period that we concentrated on, to see that another world is possible as well, like based on kind of solidarity, was really quite inspiring. You mentioned a lot about the revolutionary tradition in the global South. One again that is based on kind of learning from each other and communalism. And I think that actually, especially even in contemporary global North feminism, we have a lot to learn from that today. I mean, to give you an anecdote, I was at a seminar a few months ago looking at kind of reproductive struggles in the UK, and someone asked a question about why they have not engaged with reproductive struggles in the global South, and one of the speakers said, well, we wanted to look at contexts where we thought that we could actually learn from in the global North. No, so which was quite shocking, and in a time where in UK feminism feels quite kind of atomized and issue based, like this book just shows like how much I think we have to learn as well from how much that's holding back kind of global North feminism as well. The fact that we can't learn, or that we are blind to learn from, feminism and revolutionary action in global South. And and the kind of coherence of those revolutionary movements that the women that you do focus on were part of. Again, your book, looks at women who are doubly ignored in history. So by the fact that they're women, but also women on the left, and you mentioned, you said in the introduction of your book that when we think of revolutionaries, we think of Mao, of Lenin, of all the men, and when I thought as well of revolutionary feminisms, I also thought, well, I immediately go to revolutionary women in the global north as well, So I think of Luxemburg, I think of Alexandra Kollontai, I think of, Nadezhda Krupskaya. So this book makes that great contribution, I think, in Anglo-American literature as well, to highlight those stories. Again, how you notice like many of these sources that you worked on are coming into English translation for the first time. So that in itself is an excellent contribution. It was wonderful to me how this book focused on, and maybe it's difficult to say this, but how I would say like real true revolutionary women, So in many ways, So as you mentioned, we do have, there's an increasing tradition of kind of biography, looking at kind of women's stories in the kind of global north literature, but the stories that we're highlighting as well are women who perhaps are feminist in one sense, like you say, that there's a problematization of what it means to be feminist, but also are not engaged with kind of broader struggles of class or gender or coloniality, So, we spend a lot of time highlighting the stories of kind of like the pantheon, but we know that they were also quite, some of them, not all, but, quite against, engaging in class struggle or in engaging in kind of colonial struggle. Whereas this book looks at true revolutionary women whose lives kind of really embody also the totality of revolution, and their revolutionary practice. And you also mentioned, Marral, about actually expanding the notion as well of what it means to do revolutionary practice as well, So not just the carrying of the gun, but the revolutionary love, the revolutionary care. I really enjoyed from this book as well, the focus on revolutionary women and the kind of broader revolutionary struggle. So not just looking at women in the context of the women's struggle as well, So when we usually look at women, revolutionary women, we think of revolutionary women, doing stuff for women or the women question or expanding women's rights, but revolutionary women didn't just fight for women's issues, but for broader social justice, And as a part of that, like what you learn from this book is not just about revolutionary women's struggles, but you learn about all the broader kind of struggles and movements that I actually really didn't know that much about, or furthered my knowledge about, anti-colonial struggles that I didn't know much, or hidden histories of different parts of the world. This isn't just gender studies, this is a study of revolution. And about the left, So, learning about the brutal repression of leftist parties in Turkey, or genocidal like policies of the processes of Turkification after the establishment of the Turkish Republic, So, this serves as a reminder that reading women's history is not just women's focused history, it's simply just history, because women are part of the population. So, I mean, that kind of raised the question for me as well, maybe we can discuss this after, that, do we move away really from a category of women's history? Does this exceptionalize women? Because if we put the category of women's history against the category of history, then is history just men's history? No, it's not, right? It's history. Women's history is history. Women are people, right? Anyway, to mention as well, you mentioned as well, Sorcha, the timeliness as well of the contributions, the historical contributions of women in the revolution and in Palestine as well, highlighting as well how, history is so important, in context of the genocide that we're witnessing, like to understand contemporary realities, I digress. So again, especially in the UK, we're admiring those who are usually focused on women's liberation. There's an association that women revolutionaries are only concerned with the women question. And as a result, I think a lot of the literature in the UK does have that liberal feminist kind of outlook that you say that's the consequence of not placing women in the broader revolutionary struggles, And as a result, I do think we venerate people who then actually can be problematic in other ways, So my sister bought me a book in a well-meaning way recently for my birthday, that spoke about, you know, women and women's contribution, and again, just seeing kind of an individualistic way about women who kind of smash the glass ceiling, no? But then it's highlighting women kind of like Krista Dick, no? So good for you, you smash the glass ceiling within the police, which is institutionally very problematic, no? And, you know, her handling of the Sarah Everard scandal, no? So, you know, it's actually not even feminist in the slightest. So by placing again women in their broader revolutionary context, like this book totally avoids that. And again, like in the context of, you know, where we're seeing the Barbie movie as like a shining light of feminism, like this brings us back to what true feminism really should look like, no? And it shows how much actually your work is really needed. Thank you. I would like to bring up a little bit later and ask you about the idea of kind of biography as methods. You know, your book isn't just biography. You know, you mentioned as well the testimony from Jahan Helou, the interview as well with the Women's Democratic Front, and this is part, I think, of one of the real enjoyable parts of the book, the kind of diversity in the way that the storytelling happens. I think, and you mentioned this as one of your aims, and I really think that this was so well delivered that the book manages to highlight the lives of extraordinary women, but without drawing attention away from the collective struggle in which they're placed, no? So again, some biography has the tendency to do that, kind of venerating individuals, kind of like an exceptionalizing them, no? Or venerating individuals rather than causes, no, which is again as part of that kind of building of neoliberal subjectivities, no? But you know, you avoided this as well, kind of by collectively writing the book as well, and this is part of the praxis that kind of underlined the theme of collaboration and solidarity. And you mentioned about the placing of side by side of women. So this, you know, it never seemed like just a list of specific women's contributions, but everything came together so nicely, all the different themes and the different themes of solidarity and collaboration, and that there was a coherent narrative as well, even within those individual stories. So the only thing I thought maybe was missing was, and you brought this up yourself actually at the beginning, that the queer revolutionary struggles didn't feature as a larger part of this. You spoke about that in the introduction. I think the book does an amazing job of bringing again together the connections between different structures of oppression, those so class-based and patriarchal oppression, like colonial, post-colonial axes of domination. So actually, I see the book as a real lesson in intersectionality, like in practice. No, so the history of women in these volumes have been doubly marginalized because they are women and because they are revolutionary women on the left. You know, many of the women in the book, you know, such as the Kurdish revolutionary Sakina Jansiz that you mentioned, you know, she was Kurdish, a Levi, and a woman and a revolutionary, no? So she's marginalized across multiple axes, no? So I thought maybe the addition of that kind of particular axes of heteropatriarchal oppression and the inclusion of kind of marginalized queer revolutionaries would have enriched the book even further, and have been an overall, like an addition to the overall narrative. But maybe there's an opportunity for volume 2. So yeah, so let me just finish before I pose a few questions to you. I mean, I mentioned to you at the beginning, Marral, you know, kind of tongue-in-cheek that, you know, when I said to Devika that I would be the discussant, my initial thing was, I've got to read a book, you know. But you mentioned that one of your aims was to make it readable. And I mean, if you haven't read the book already, this is an intensely readable and enjoyable book. So, you know, congratulations in achieving that aim. It really was a very easy book to read. And you mentioned that as actually being part of your kind of aims and methodology, you know, to that there is a kind of a Marxist feminist praxis here and part of a wider tradition as well. So we look at people like Krupskaya and you know, Eleanor Marx as well, that to make things that are, you know, difficult revolutionary concepts accessible to the masses is the point and a part of revolutionary practice. So I think you can see her work as really part of this tradition. And you know, the inclusion of activists and not just academics. I think too often, you know, we can easily look at these subjects and talk about them within our epistemic communities now, and what is actually the point of that, is to have this such an accessible and enjoyable and readable book is a wonderful thing. So thank you very much. Okay, so I have a few questions then for you, and then we can open up to the wider audience. So first of all, we had a book launch a few years ago now, probably in the middle of the pandemic. One of our colleagues, Rafi, and her co-author, Brenda Bandwa, wrote a book about, well, edited as well, a book, Revolutionary Feminisms. And I particularly remember from that book launch, either Rafi or Brenda mentioning that, you know, if your activism is your academia, then you're not doing enough, no? Which struck a chord with me, and it's a constant like fear of mine, and many of my colleagues know that we're not doing enough. So, you know, the richness of the book as well is that it's written not just by academics, but also by activists. There's a strong theme of revolutionary practice and praxis. So again, my friends and I who do research on feminism and on feminist issues and have a keen interest in kind of socialist feminism and Marxist feminism have been discussing, well, how do we get involved? How do we make that jump from academia to activism and kind of revolutionary struggle? So I suppose like the question is, what kind of key takeaways do you think that we can learn from these women that we can maybe apply to our lives?
Yeah. Can I just pick up on, before I answer the question, one thing you said, which I found quite interesting about the kind of comparison to these books, like, you know, top 10 women who shaped the world, Hillary Clinton. I think like the title is slightly like riffing on that, like revolutionary women who shaped the world. And when Jihan, who's like a very serious revolutionary woman, found the title, I don't think she would mind me saying, she was like, what, this is sensationalist, you know, like I didn't shape the world, we failed. So I think it's kind of, yeah, the format and the style is, and the title is almost like playing on that genre, but obviously trying to do it very, very differently. But it does make me laugh sometimes. On academia and activism, it's also the same sometimes the other way around, isn't it? If your academia is too activist, it's not legitimate. Which, to be honest, is probably the critique I've encountered more, especially in the Danish context, where I did my PhD. There's a big kind of public debate going on about that relationship, as there is in many places. But obviously, kind of working on Palestine, I don't think it's, you know, I think it's illegitimate to not be activist at the same time. So actually, I'm not going to go into the whole thing that happened, but basically it's, you know, it's both, I think, I mean, I don't know, join local groups, get involved in any way you can. But sometimes I find the struggles more on the other side from academia, which can like look, you know, negatively upon you if you're trying to do things with both hands at the same time. There's probably something else to say about publishing in the kind of world of academia, where it values individual, single-authored publications in academic, you know, formats. Whereas so this, like, you know, this wouldn't really count as much in our careers, our academic careers. But obviously we didn't do it because of that. We did it because we think it's a valuable tool for movements. But it's also nice to intervene in academic debates and show them that you can do things slightly differently, and it has a lot of academic value. So that's, I looked at the other side of your question a little bit more.
Yeah. I had a thought I wanted to share. Oh yeah, I think this question of like, I think there's a whole debate around it, but like, who is a revolutionary? What is a revolutionary? And I guess in a way, like watering down to some extent, like, oh, anything is a revolutionary. Anyone is a revolutionary. All these roles of revolutionary is still something to complicate. And I think that I still haven't kind of worked out myself, you know. But I just think the stories and like the lives of, you know, women that we kind of put together in this book really just for me, as someone who kind of always initially would have looked at, yes, you know, anti-colonial movements, leftist movements, I had a very set idea of what, you know, a revolutionary would be. I even had imagined ideas of, you know, the class background of some of these revolutionaries. And then I was actually quite shocked that actually almost always they came from upper class backgrounds. You know, and so in that way, I kind of, I just think there's so much to learn from the variety of, I guess, roles that, you know, people engaged in this book. But this question of like policing activism and are you doing enough? I just sort of sometimes think, you know, not everyone can be a political activist, not everybody can be an organizer. And actually, there's a need for academics to be academics, to write. There's a need for writers to write. There's a need for people to do research and then to, you know, feed that into and kind of engage, I guess, with the movements that probably need that the most. So it's a question I think about sometimes, actually. Yeah.
But I think you're right. Like I think the problem is when these things get separated and we get big walls built up in between them. There is a role for academic thorough research, but it's, you know, have to find the ways to make it not just staying within the walls of the academy. And that's, I think, where the problem sometimes lies. Yeah.
It is a question that keeps me up at night. Thank you so much. And again, like we mentioned before, like I think the richness of the book is the kind of diverse ways in which the stories are told. You know, Sorcha, you also spoke about, you know, again, like the accessibility, like that kind of tradition coming from the books, and you know, you already spoke about some parts of the methodology as well, and the role of kind of like highlighting agency as well of women. But I just wanted to maybe push a little bit further, because there's this trend as well of kind of women's biography and feminist biography, and again, there's the lib fem biography. There's a little bit more of an emerging trend of kind of Marxist feminist biography as well. I wanted maybe to like discuss that a little bit further about what you see as the value of biography as kind of methodology and as a tool. I think, Marral, you mentioned the idea of kind of contrasting with that kind of male iconography as well, and the idea of history from below. But yeah, what do you see as kind of like the value? What can kind of biography kind of do in this?
Can I also add some questions from the audience?
Yeah.
Oh, so you should keep that in mind.
Yeah.
Think of more. So first I will prioritize data, then oh my god, Hamish, and then I know your name, sorry. So go ahead.
I got the impression that there was in this study which you made some kind of a heightened level of solidarity. But I'm not sure if you touched the point that did this woman experience any kind of a discrimination within the movements themselves, or were they able to stand as equal revolutionary subjects within those movements?
Thank you so much. Yeah, I've read a bit of the book, look forward to reading more. Yeah, a couple of questions. So I think you highlight that it's like a kind of global anti-imperialist movement at the time, right? I was just wondering, were there any kind of tensions within that? Was solidarity straightforward? Are there different gender relations, nature of imperialism in local contexts that complicate relationships between them? And second question, I think you mentioned the death of like this anti-imperialist feminist movement, right? Is it as simple as saying that's the death of the USSR, or are there kind of other mechanisms driving that? I think in your chapter you talk about this Cuban organization that was in 2019, is that right?
Yeah, Oswald. Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, thanks for the presentation. And as I say, look forward to reading more.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I haven't read the book, but it really looks like a very extraordinary contribution. Like,
Also on sale right now.
great discount. No, but as Saskia said, not only on the history of feminism or women, but the history for us to understand the history of revolutionary politics more generally, right? And in this sense, like I wonder, or I'd like to hear a bit more about your thoughts on how have things changed in the sense of the role of women in contemporary kind of revolutionary politics, and this kind of, you know, it blurs the kind of also it bears on the question of the change in revolutionary politics themselves, right? You mentioned Sorcha, for example, the fact that we are living now in a unipolar world, right? And this changes in many ways, like the possibilities and the nature of revolutionary politics. So there are changes in this direction as well. And for example, also it was mentioned the disappearance of certain kind of international institutions, let's say, or networks, but at the same time, you have, at least in Latin America, for example, the feminist movement have acquired like capacities of mass mobilization that you didn't see before, right? So there has been obviously like a very important developments on that front as well. So yeah, if you can just reflect based on this very comprehensive kind of panorama that you lay out, how things have changed, both advances and retreats, I guess.
So lots of questions here. So we'll hopefully maybe have time for one more round, but right now I'm going to hand it back over to the speakers.
Okay. I can start briefly on picking up on the biography question, just briefly, in terms of like how I approached it, as a sort of pedagogical tool. My chapter on the Cuban Revolution, told through Melba Hernandez, is like, I wrote it so that someone who doesn't know about the Cuban Revolution could learn about the Cuban Revolution, but learn about it through a woman's experience, which points us to all sorts of things that you might not learn about if you read it through the kind of dominant historiography of it. So you learn about the houses which like looked after revolutionaries, and you learn about the moments in between the large-scale battles. So for me, it was a sort of just not just, but a pedagogical tool for telling a revolutionary history, but there's many other ways of doing it. There's a lot of questions, but you say.
Well, I'll just say kind of on that point of method, I think it almost speaks back to your previous question as well, because it's like, okay, history from below is so important. We need to sort of write different histories, but as the movement itself, it's still kind of centered sort of, men. So this kind of feminist method of biography is like really important to sort of understand women in their own words. But then the class aspect to that is that which women write and which women could, actually engage in sort of memoir writing and biography writing. So it's, it's, I guess, for us who both engage in sort of historical work, biographies are amazing sort of to engage with and encounter, but it's not the only thing. As a feminist method, it's so important to kind of try and engage with as many sort of fragments and traces and things that we can find that might tell us more. This question about the role of women in contemporary movements and how things have changed is something that we've talked about quite a bit, because in a way, when you look at sort of the sort of infrastructures and the time that the movements we're writing about existed, that kind of the presence of the Soviet Union and having that challenge to a unipolar world was it created so many opportunities for conferences, for meetings, for all kinds of international activities, which whether or not the Soviet Union, like at that time, was still a communist sort of state. Besides that point, it still facilitated and allowed a lot of things that we don't really have today. And I guess another thing with a lot of the women in this book is that they were part of organizations that kind of were, and well, many of them, Marxist-Leninist. They had a very kind of centralized sort of understanding of organizing politically. And when you think about movements today, things are way more fragmented. We don't really have that anymore. And I think about it sometimes in the sort of Iranian context, where last year everyone was talking about the feminist revolution, and almost over the last sort of few years, there's always been talk about how brilliant it is to have a leaderless revolution. And when you really think about that, a leaderless revolution, like in theory, is it a great thing, but maybe isn't. And actually, the powerful forces at play will always come and sort of hijack that leaderless aspect. So it's I guess things have changed so much, and in the Middle East, and well, when we think of Iran or Afghanistan or Iraq, you know, these are countries that had incredible communist movements, they had incredible socialist movements, they had really strong positions, you know, women in really important positions in those movements at times. And in the same way that the Cold War has that kind of Cold War politics led to the kind of destruction of communism, it's also kind of, in at least sort of the Middle East contexts, you know, in many countries, sort of defeated the feminist movements in some way and sort of created new ones. And so the chapter in the book on the WDF is quite nice in Pakistan, because they're a group that are a socialist feminist organization. They are facing a lot of state repression, but they can organize and they're not underground. And conversations between like that sort of group with, you know, the women's kind of movement in Iran today, the kind of more radical women's movement today, you realize that the capacity to engage is very difficult, because in Pakistan they can exist, whereas in Iran they are underground or have to be in exile. So there's just so many, yeah, I guess it kind of links to some of the sort of counterinsurgency or counter-revolutionary kind of practices of this sort of global sort of capitalist imperialist system that the book speaks to, which through the loss of certain infrastructures has then kind of dismantled movements and organizations in certain ways. So I'm sometimes quite pessimistic about forms of political organizing today, but
yeah, no, thank you, Marral. You always have so much great things to say, and especially insights from like around like feminist struggle. I always appreciate hearing what you had to say. Thank you for the questions about solidarity, which I can probably speak to both at the same time. I think about the contentions within it. Yeah, I think there's a big risk and a tendency within these types of histories to romanticize these pasts and talk about, and I did it, I talked about how it was horizontal, these horizontal structures of solidarity. And then there's the argument that after the 80s, it started to become more vertical with the global north and the global south. But I think we have to be quite careful when we talk about this third world as solidarity as operating in like horizontal equal terms. Of course, there were socialist states who were able to offer things to national liberation movements in exile, which couldn't be returned back. But there were inequalities amongst this. There was discrimination. There were powerful groups and less powerful groups. There were fractures within it. There were disagreements. Of course, all these things existed at the same time. So how can we then see it as a kind of as a collective solidarity? And I think for me, I think this is why history is important, because a lot of these times these things weren't like, I think that there was a collective pursuit of a common ground. I mean, if the basis was an anti-colonial solidarity at the Bandung Conference in 1955, the directions in which that was taken by the mid-70s were completely different. The Tricontinental Conference pursued a much more militant anti-capitalist approach to that, leading to massive splits in this so-called third world movement. But you can often see efforts to overcome difference. And I think that's often what solidarity comes down to. It's not the fact that it's homogenous groups operating on the same terms all the time. It's the building of common ground across difference, with, you know, a belief in the shared basis of your liberation. And I guess, yeah, these things sometimes only emerge over time when you begin to see these things as mutual relations over time, whereby, I mean, in a practical sense, which maybe speaks to the bigger idea, for example, Palestinians who are trained in the Cuban medical schools have launched and led transnational solidarity campaigns with Cuba for the release of the Miami Five, who were imprisoned unjustly in the US. So you see the sense of returning solidarity, even if it happens 30 years after you felt you received that solidarity. I mean, it's a kind of not perfect example, but I think it shows how we need to view solidarities historically in order to really understand how they exist as sort of mutual relations over time. Yeah. Anyone?
Okay, cool. Other question. Oh, there's a short one, but can you please speak into this? I know it's a small room and it seems ridiculous, but
That was amazing. Thank you so much. You've given me goosebumps listening to you. This a short question. So you mentioned that you're wanting to make it accessible, and a lot of this sort of content is normally generated in English. So I guess my question is, are you going to translate it?
Yeah, I mean, that would be amazing. I mean, I think it's down to the publishers, basically. And what I don't know, Marral, do you know?
I mean, yeah, and I guess, I mean, I think what we learned through this process was that, like, yeah, without saying too much, publishers make all the decisions. Edited volumes like this, actually, publishers don't even love, because, you know, they prefer single authored pieces of work. But I think there would be interest for them to, like, translate it, right? But no, I think it would be really important.
There's going to be a South African edition brought out at prices relevant to the South African market, which obviously isn't in translation, but it is making it accessible to the South African audience. And the Women's Democratic Front of Pakistan are translating their contribution and publishing it in a feminist magazine in Pakistan. So it might be more like that, like the individual chapters which speak to certain places, get translated in that way. But obviously it would be great to have it translated into multiple languages.
So other questions, because otherwise I'm going to be inspired quicker. But I'm literally holding the mic. This is an opportunity to ask. So if people know publishers that can translate this in another language, I think we need to send Sorcha and Marral an email. I can think of some. I don't know. Well, yeah, if there's anything I can do to help, that would be great. I want to echo that sentiment, goosebumps, really, because, you know, they're really bleak times, and obviously a lot of these movements didn't succeed, but it's good to know that that this sentiment exists. Like, the sentiment that exists now has always existed. Like, it's not new, which can be both demoralizing or uplifting depending on, you know, how we see it and our mood. But I guess, small note of appreciation, I really loved how it was very theoretically grounded, and as an academic, that I always find that super satisfying, even though you're right, it's extremely accessibly written. So yes, I encourage everyone to buy it. As I said, I've just bought it from Huda Books, and it is like slightly discounted at the moment. Okay, so the question that I have 3 questions for you. And I guess one of them is related to what Inka asked you, specifically because you mentioned that, I think when you were talking about specifically the women from Iran, I didn't quite catch their name. And the person who said it was a militant poet, and part of the purpose of the poetry was to encourage women to be involved in the armed struggle. And I guess, like, since many of the women that you outlined did have multiple roles, as you mentioned, it's sort of not like a linear or a unified, unique narrative for all the women that you highlight in the book. So is it that this encouragement was needed specifically because that these movements did relegate the question of, I guess, not necessarily women's liberation, but sort of bringing issues that perhaps just because they were being brought up by women, or they had implications for households, or they had implications that sort of disproportionately affected women, were sidelined? Because, yeah, oftentimes we can see that happening in many of these leftist spaces. The other question that I had was about, that you kind of mentioned at the beginning, that the idea of feminism is tricky for a lot of these women because it's seen as a sort of liberal bourgeois movement. And I wonder, like, so what could you elaborate on that? Like, what did they feel about the notion of feminism as a concept, if they did say something about it, or if you can draw some conclusions about the feminism? Though I do agree with Saskia that I think, I guess it's a tricky, it's a slippery slope to call something true, or like have a purist notion of what feminism is. But I guess unless feminism is genuinely like third world is. It's not global. It's not feminism. So yeah, I guess my idea of feminism is sort of intersectional third world, anti-colonial, anti-capitalist feminism. So I wonder what if you have any idea what women thought about, these women specifically thought about it. And I guess finally, if you have time, this idea of revolutionary love on the front line, I found extremely interesting. And I wonder what the consequence of it was, even for like, what did that look like? And did that also translate to the men on the front lines in the Kurdish movement, practicing, experiencing, identifying with it? Did it change the nature of the movement in some way? Yeah, I'd be interested in. Thanks.
Okay, so I can start with the Iran question. Well, thank you also for the questions and just the very close engagement. Also, the general reception has been really nice. It's very like sweet and humbling to hear that it does land well. So the question of gender with the Iranian like leftist movement of the 60s and 70s is really interesting, because so the poetry, you know, that Marzia writes about, the poetry is sort of, it's intended to kind of mobilize women. At the time, women wouldn't really, like, women were a minority in terms of joining the militant kind of leftist guerrilla groups. And so in that sense, I think you're touching on something that is really important, that women were needed in order for those revolutionaries to engage in underground activities, because I kind of mentioned that idea of a team house earlier, and what the Iranian militant left would do is that they would live in houses just in a normal neighborhood, and they would assume or pretend, or sometimes they would have relationships with men and women. So you couldn't just have a team house of just men, because the people in the neighborhood would be like, that's really weird. So women were really needed in that sense. And actually the chapter on Marzia's life begins with this scene where I was sort of trying to uncover, like, how did she die? She died at the age of 29. Like, guerrillas and revolutionary women and men in that movement would sign up to the movement knowing that they had a lifespan of like probably 6 months. Because they were underground, they were engaging in clandestine activities. It was really dangerous. It's not clear whether she was actually shot by the security forces or swallowed a cyanide pill, but it's likely that she swallowed the cyanide pill, because that's what they would do to stop themselves from getting arrested and then being forced into sort of revealing stuff about their networks. In that story, she's sort of running away from police officers and security agents, because they've identified that, like, she was meant to meet someone, and they'd been kind of stalking her. And so this kind of scene is really interesting, because she's wearing a chador, which is like a full-length veil over her body, and when the security forces get to her, they can't believe that it's a woman. They thought it was a man dressed in a woman's kind of veil. So in that sense, it kind of also speaks to the gender politics, that it was just unbelievable that women would engage in stuff like that. And they could actually take on really important roles, such as smuggling notes into prisons and engaging in all kinds of work. And as you say, like, there's so many gendered roles that they would have to otherwise engage in, whether it was in the house. I mean, there's not much written about it, but presumably the cooking, the cleaning, these sorts of roles, and the writing. That's kind of that's a really interesting question.
Like, sorry to interrupt, but I think, like, a lot of times if you're in sort of that space now, you often see the person doing the notes.
Some things don't change.
I don't know how to answer your question about how these women thought about feminism, because it does vary so much across the chapters, but maybe Marral can say something. I would rather say something about the revolutionary love concept and principle, because we mentioned how it was practiced by the Kurdish women, but and you say whether that would have extended to the men, but I think, like, absolutely, and I think it was also practiced by a lot of the men in these movements. As a principle, you know, it's radical love for humanity and life that drives our revolutionary work, but potentially also as like a strategy. In Cuba, like at least there's like documents of how they were, which were sent to the Palestinian Revolution actually and translated into Arabic, about how to establish a base, how to make sure that the local population is like friendly to your presence, how to establish like mass support. So it's a kind of, I guess also, it's a principle, it's a strategy, but I think 100% would be practiced by, you know, the men as well as the women in these movements. Not always. Yeah.
Do you think that if this revolutionary love or care came from women, and do you think it doesn't still replicate any kind of a patriarchal relations within the movement?
I think for sure I don't know if I would necessarily say like, maybe that's where I differentiate between like revolutionary love and care. Like I kind of see them as different things, but definitely the fact that it was women taking up these care roles was a reflection of the patriarchal relations within these movements, and that very much was, you know, hasn't been overcome. In fact, it's probably been extended in many ways. Yeah.
And maybe just also on that point, like I think your question about discrimination earlier is really important, because there is a lot of that. And I think, for instance, just in the sense of kind of how patriarchy worked in this Iranian context, women who did join these militant groups had to be extremely hypermasculine. They had to present themselves in certain ways in order to survive in that space. And they did encounter a lot of discrimination in that kind of gendered sense, class sense to some extent too. I think one of the things we thought about with this book was this question of race. How does it come into this book? And actually, racial formations are so different in different contexts. And I guess how we understand it, you know, in a metropolitan place like where we are today, or kind of the politics we engage in, it looks very different to, for instance, what a very kind of almost homogenous Iranian context looked like, or, you know, other contexts looked like. So in a way, there's so much in this book that it's really would almost do it a disservice to try to generalize on some of these points. So we really kind of haven't engaged in some of that. I guess some of the chapters themselves kind of would look at those sorts of things. And then I guess just on this question of feminism, possibly the majority of women in this book wouldn't use the word feminism. We make this distinction ourselves where we sort of say, like, just because they didn't identify as feminists, it doesn't mean that we can't use that as an analytic kind of category to understand what they were doing. And even though, you know, the poetry wasn't necessarily feminist, we can see moments and sort of some traces and hints of feminism here or there. But for the most part, I think it reflects the time in which these women operated, where even until the 70s, probably early 80s, like that marks this feminist relationship was very kind of tense, generally speaking. Yeah, I'm gonna stop there.
Great. So if there are any other questions, we're gonna have to save them for later. Let's thank our speakers and discuss it. So usually we have a wine reception that follows. Unfortunately, because I don't know.